of the first day of the Cybersecurity Forum is about to start. So without further delays, I would like to introduce the moderator and the host of the Securing Digital DNA by Building Cyber Peace and Stability panel. The host of the panel is Ambassador Marek Szczygieł, International Cybersecurity Policy Coordinator, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And his guests are Ambassador Robert Strayer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy, U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Rudier Bonn, Deputy Federal Government Commissioner for Disarmament, Arms Control and Cyber Policy, Germany. Raul Rick, National Cybersecurity Policy Director, Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications. And last but not least, Ligareta Rosenthal, Director of European Union Governmental Affairs for Cybersecurity Policy and Security of Emerging Technologies, Microsoft. I pass it to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction. And let me welcome you at this final panel today dedicated to the issues that are very topical right now. Securing digital DNA by building cyber peace and stability. We are right now witnessing many international process development that is focused on multilateral approaches to cyber peace and stability. This is, I think, in the common interest to try to ensure that entire international community is able to enjoy this peace and stability in cyberspace. Because this is the issue that unites actually many stakeholders, including states, civil society, international organizations, academia, private sector. And right now there are many activities, initiatives that are making contribution actually to advancing this goal, bigger, greater stability of cyberspace, peace in cyberspace. But key governmental, at least intergovernmental processes happening right now, they take place in the framework of United Nations, where those activities are carried out on the basis of two resolutions adopted last year by the General Assembly of United Nations. Those two resolutions created two groups. First, open-ended working group that is actually have broad membership. It includes all members of the United Nations, and a group of governmental experts, actually a new edition of this group that consists of 25 members right now. But it is also worth to remember, and I hope in this panel we also address this angle, namely that not only governments are trying to contribute to this common goal, but also there are many bottom-up initiatives which are often initiated and supported and run by private sector, by some initiatives that includes non-governmental organizations. I can mention here, for example, the Tech Accord or the Paris Call, but also Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. So I think today, during this panel, I would like to ask our panelists, first of all, with relation to this ongoing discussion in the UN framework, how to achieve some level of complementarity between those two parallel processes, open-ended working group and group of governmental experts. At this stage of those processes, after the first substantial meeting of the open-ended working group that took place in September, after some consultations between GGE and regional organizations, do we have some reasons for optimism that this will be not something that will increase the existing polarization, but rather bring all relevant actors closer? Maybe we start with you, Rüdiger.
Yeah. Thank you. Before I start, I'd like to have one word about my current function. Maybe you have seen in the program that I'm actually in charge in Berlin in the Foreign Ministry for that I'm in charge for arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament issues. And we decided only 2 months ago to merge this portfolio with another portfolio, the portfolio on cyber security policy and cyber foreign policy, which is an interesting combination, but we see a lot of commonalities between the cyber issues and also arms control and disarmament issues. We see cyber as kind of an additional domain for future conflicts, like other new domains like outer space or lethal autonomous weapon systems. We see similar instruments like behavior-based approaches that we use for cyber activities as well as for lethal autonomous weapon systems or the outer space discussions. So a lot of commonalities, and that's why this merger of the two portfolio. Regarding your question, the UN processes, now we have, as you know, two parallel processes, two groups. One is the GGE, the group of governmental experts. The other group is the open-ended working groups that have very similar mandates. Of course, the GGE is a smaller group that has only a small number of member countries working in the group, and the OEWG is of course more inclusive, is open-ended. But again, the mandates are similar, but we don't see that these two groups are working against each other. We see the potential that the two groups can support each other. And we also noticed after the first meeting of the open-ended working group in New York City that there is some consensus to build on the results of previous GGEs. There were already 5 GGEs during previous years. And in particular, there is some consensus to build on this principle that international law is applicable to the cyber domain, which is very important for us, and an important start. And I think there's no need to harmonize the two groups. It's important that they are well coordinated. And there are a number of questions that will have to be discussed now. It's the question of the scope of the discussions. Is it only about war and peace, security policy, which we would prefer as Germany, or will it go beyond this idea? Will other things be on the agenda like terrorism, cybercrime, human rights, and so on? And there's also the question of future formats after the end of the OEWG and the GGE. The question, should we create kind of a new format, a new organization? Should the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva take over the process or not? All this is not yet answered. Then there are discussions on capacity building, on security and confidence building measures. So there's a lot of work that both groups could deal with. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the previous editions of groups of governmental experts reached consensus on a kind of framework for stability in cyberspace based on the voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, on the applicability of entire international law, and on the implementation of confidence-building measures. Do we have really more clarity now, Robert, with regard how to implement, actually, how to apply international law in specific situations related to activities of the states in cyberspace. Do you see some evolution here? And actually, if those two parallel processes will reach, let's say, different conclusions with this regard, what will be the impact on our global cyber stability?
Well, now you've asked me the harder questions. First, let me thank you for organizing this panel, allowing me to participate on this, and it's great to be with such great thought leaders here in Poland. You know, as the ambassador said, there's a complementarity between these two processes, and he pointed out the previous successful GGEs, and I would note that those GGE reports have all gotten acclaim and sort of ratification by the whole General Assembly in 2016, 2017, and 2018. So having that common understanding going into these two new processes mean we start from a point of large agreement. I think we also need to recognize the goal that we want is not just text that's useful, or not to diminish the importance of international law, but we want to have the universal acceptance through the actions of nation states of acting in a way that understands that international law matters in cyberspace, understanding that norms of responsible behavior should guide their activities as well. So we want to see this universal acceptance of the understandings. I think the international law is always going to be something that's fact-dependent. That's the way law works. Your question is, I think, a little bit more, how do we get to a point where we have better understandings about how those facts should be applied to the UN Charter and to international law generally, and our understandings of international law? I think those are just going to be borne out case by case over time. But what both these processes can do, I think that one, in the broader group, the open-ended working group, there's a great deal of capacity building that needs to occur to allow all countries that are UN members to fully understand and internalize what we mean by these norms of responsible state behavior, by international law, and by confidence building measures. So I think there's a lot of tweaks that can happen to capacity building, what we mean by that framework of responsible state behavior. And in the GGE, I think we can see more of, what it's been so valuable in the past is reaching consensus with a relatively smaller group of true experts in international law about the particular implementation of norms of responsible state behavior and implementation of international law. Of course, building off of those three previous consensus GGE reports. So I think there's, both of them can provide complementary functions, and they need those chairs, which I think are very closely linked up to make sure they're coordinating. And I think that's how we can ensure that they're both successful processes.
I will press you a little bit still here, because a kind of important issue here is the accountability of the states for their actions under international law. And here I think we can see also kind of growing understanding that we must hold especially those states that do not behave responsibly, accountable for their actions. How to achieve this kind of common understanding, and how to also kind of reach broader understanding of the necessity of this kind of state accountability.
So as part of our national cyber strategy that we released last September, we've talked about the need to develop a consensus format of like-minded countries who will build a voluntary coalition that will call out behavior that we deem to be beyond the scope of what's responsible in cyberspace, and then to develop consequences that we can use to deter nation states from behaving in ways that are malicious in the future. So at the beginning of the high-level week at the UN on September 23rd, 28 states joined together to sign on to a joint statement. First of all, committing to having a positive engagement in the 2 UN processes, but also noting the importance of holding nation states that act in contravention of those norms of responsible state behavior and of international law accountable for their activities, including considering appropriate consequences. We know that cyber tools are used by some nation states as ways to achieve goals in an asymmetric manner, to achieve goals they couldn't otherwise achieve. And so they need to have some degree of consequence felt to alter their risk calculus about whether they should continue to use such tools in the future. So I think that's how we can start to generate actually a sense of accountability.
This actually joint statement on advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace signed in New York in September is a kind of additional contribution to this advancement of responsible state behavior. But there is also a very important role of other stakeholders here, and we hear some voices coming from the industry that this catalog of norms of responsible state behavior is not perfect, that maybe we need to consider some additional norms. How can business and civil society, which are actually key players in the cybersecurity ecosystem, contribute on one hand to the ongoing debate in the UN framework, on the other hand, if you can maybe inspire or complement this debate with your own contribution. Liga, please.
First of all, thank you for including Microsoft as well on this panel among government representatives. I think that already goes a long way in showing that the need to have a multi-stakeholder approach to many issues in cybersecurity globally. I wanted to go back and touch on some of the questions that you had already asked the previous panelists on the UN processes ongoing, as especially the open-ended working group has emphasized multi-stakeholderism and involvement of other non-governmental actors in the process. Having been, I have the privileged role of being an advisor to one delegation that sits on the open-ended working group and could participate in the processes in the meeting in September. And I took away a bit of a different conclusion about the consensus that was in the room that week at the open-ended working group. I think that the issue of international law does not have a consensus among the nations in the United Nations. Unfortunately, I think this will be a difficult issue to address throughout the two processes. But there are a few things that there is consensus on that I think can be built upon. First of all, the transparency that has been emphasized by the Swiss chairman in the open-ended working group, I think, is very important. And it was quite apparent that all the nations that spoke at the open-ended working group really appreciated the opportunity to say the wide scope of issues that they're concerned about in cyberspace. There was also a wide consensus that this should be a multi-stakeholder process, that there are other voices that should be included. And it was quite unfortunate that the 18 organizations that applied to be at the open-ended working group in September were not allowed to be there. But hopefully that in December this will change, and there will be organizations such as Microsoft in a traditional sense, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, Chatham House, and many of the other organizations, Global Cyber Alliance, and many, many more that wanted to be a part of that process and have a say. But thirdly, I think one important point is also looking at a capacity building within this context and what comes out of these processes on capacity building. And here it's especially important to look at what industry and civil society could bring to this discussion, because when you look at implementation of these norms, that I believe is a government process to identify which norms will be addressed through the UN processes, it will be very important for industry and civil society to demonstrate the implementation of these norms. And one of the issues that Microsoft is very adamant about is the promotion of the Paris Call for Trust and Stability in Cyberspace, which champions 9 specific sort of challenges in cyberspace and addressing those in a way that can bring the action necessary to make these norms actually implemented and become custom in the global space.
Thank you very much. I agree that one of the issues that was highlighted by many delegations during this first meeting of the Open End Working Group was capacity building. So capacity building related not only to actual cyber security to strengthen the resilience of particular countries, but also capacity to implement actually those agreed norms, yes, those voluntary norms. Another issue is also the capacity, especially on the regional level, to implement confidence building measures. This is something that is also not equally distributed among the countries. Raul, how do you see the role of this kind of cooperation? Because Estonia is contributing substantially to capacity building, cooperation with other countries, and you have also well-established kind of brand as a digital country. So do you think that this is the opportunity to bridge this gap, digital gap that is very often discussed?
Yes, as we all know, there are three levels in this international cooperation, and one is the common understanding about the norms, then is the confidence building measures, and then the capacity building, of course. And I think that the capacity building is of course, it's very, very important topic because countries are simply in very different situations. First of all, with their digital development, and along with that, the understanding of the cyber risks and the capacity what they actually have to deal with these risks. So I'm not a cyber diplomat, but I'm looking at these questions from the national cybersecurity perspective. And actually, before I came back to the government service, I was dealing with capacity building for many years. I worked as a consultant for many governments around the world, and I saw the different difficulties or challenges that the countries face. For example, some of the countries are simply dealing with the issue that they are landlocked, and they have the communication lines coming to another country, and they know that these countries are probably trying to understand what is going on in the networks. Another country is dealing with elections security, for example. There is another country who is very much concerned about 5G security, and so on, so on. So, and all these countries have different levels of understanding of the cyber issues. In developing countries, the biggest difficulty is that who is responsible of cybersecurity and how to understand these questions that all talk about in more digitalized countries. And it comes back to the question that what these countries bring on the table in this open-ended working group. So it's very good format for all these different countries to, first of all, bring their issues on the table, discuss about that, but it's also a very good format to to raise awareness and also educate some countries to how to approach to these cyber issues that they are not actually dealing on daily basis. So I would say that there is a lot to do in order to raise the capacity, first of all, to understand the cyber risks and also to create the different institutional organizations, functions that they need to deal with these issues that more developed countries are talking about. And also one more aspect, while consulting different countries, what I have noticed is that there's usually politicians not interested about cybersecurity at all. They don't, first of all, let's say, care about that as a first priority. They want to develop the countries regarding the digital services that they want to bring to the society. And they start to deal with these cyber issues when there is no other way to pass them. So, and if you talk about the process at the United Nations level, then it's we have to be careful that what is the level of maturity in these countries to, to be part of this discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I think this is a very important aspect that, if we want to, like-minded countries, if we want to really promote this model of cyberspace, internet, open, free, secure, accessible, we must also provide some support, some assistance in building local national capacity, because otherwise there might be kind of alternative model that will be available for many countries that are struggling actually with very basic administrative or institutional and technical capabilities. So I think this might be kind of part of this outreach directed towards countries that are at the early stage, yes, of building their national cybersecurity systems. And you mentioned also this coordination aspects on the national level. I think this is one of the lessons learned that can be exported, promoted, yes, as one of the best practices in this case. I'd like to return to one of the issues mentioned at the beginning of our panel, namely that we should treat those aspects of cyber stability as part of big portfolio peace and stability related issues, especially in the UN context. Those are issues reserved for the first committee. But there are also some controversies here, and they are related to the different nature of cyberspace, to different from those traditional hard security areas. One of those differences is a high level of anonymity that we see. So it is difficult to attribute actually the malicious cyber operations in cyberspace. So I'd like to ask panelists how to actually overcome this dilemma, that in order to actually advance this stability in cyberspace, we must be able to achieve clarity with regard to the attribution. At the same time, this is the area where states prefer to operate not openly in the covert operations. Rudiger?
Yeah. Again, I'd like to state that we have this problem of attribution in the cyber domain. We have it also in other domains. Think of chemical weapons attacks in Syria, for instance, or in the UK, the famous Skripal case. So as the world becomes more and more complex, things get more and more blurred, and of course, attribution is a big challenge. I think a good response was found by the EU by means of the so-called a cyber toolbox, which is a kind of escalatory list of measures that could be taken once a misbehavior or cyber attack was detected. And of course, it starts with relatively soft measures like naming and shaming, exposing the respective attacker. And then it goes to economic sanctions or even countermeasures, depending also on the scope of the attack. I think this is a good framework that allows the EU countries together and build on consensus to react to cyber attacks and also to react to different levels of certainty if it comes to the attribution problem. So if we have a crystal clear case, then it's maybe more appropriate to take more robust measures. If not, then we could start with less robust measures. Thank you.
I agree with that last point 100% too, that there's ways that we can have calibrated responses to the degrees of confidence we have and where the attack may be emanating from. I think as a first proposition, I'd just like to put it kind of the other extreme of this is you're kind of pointing out the difficulty of attribution in some cases, but I also point out that the first or the last refuge of the malicious attacker is always to say, I need no more information. No one can ever do attribution in this field. That is absolutely not the case. That is exactly what they say when a number of states join together and say, we know it was you and we know this is what happened. Like any decision in a government at the highest level, it is a policy decision to do an attribution. There's a number of technical criteria that experts within government can generate, and there's information that can be shared across governments. There's well-known academic papers, and even we put out U.S. government papers looking at techniques, tactics, and procedures. The private sector also has well-worn practices of how they've largely determined that certain actors to be associated with certain nation states. Ultimately, though, of course, this is a sovereign decision, a policy decision. I think what we really need to do the most at work in the field of is figuring out how we can better share information between governments, finding the right points of contact between different relevant agencies to share that information over time so that governments have what they need to make the total picture for them to make that policy decision because every government has a slightly different set of institutional frameworks for how they would make such a significant decision. So we need to empower that framework or that set of institutions and understand how we need to share information among them. We in no way should let the challenges slow us down, but it is a challenge that should be worked with a high degree of effort. Thanks.
Liga, please.
I can reflect also on the EU Cyber Toolbox. We had an interesting discussion in Brussels at the end of September where the EU member states came together with several representatives from industry and civil society to discuss what is the role of non-governmental actors in the toolbox. And to be fair, when the toolbox was developed, it was looking exactly at what the tools are within the EU to address malicious cyber attacks. So this was a very good introductory discussion to see how what are the assets on both sides of the fence that we can combine to eventually lead to this decision of the political decision on cyber sanctions, which is clearly a decision made at the governmental level. So some of the things that we concluded are that we're more or less working in parallel. Just yesterday, the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center also recognized that we saw in our networks attacks on sports federations by an actor we call Strontium. We've also recognized that this is the same state-sponsored actor that in the fall was conducting attacks on non-governmental organizations' websites as well. So industry is also looking at what we can do to recognize the attacks that are ongoing and also to bring more awareness on state-sponsored attacks and urged governments to also take this information into consideration. One more thing that we've looked at is, and I want to commend, is the work of the Cyber Peace Institute that just was founded. Microsoft was a supporter of that idea and happily sees this as a source that can work on providing forensic evidence that industry can provide to governments to see if this is something that they need to take into consideration. So I think that there's lots of things that industry and civil society can contribute in this discussion on accountability or attribution, while at the same time recognizing this is a government decision.
Yes, I think this is a very good example of this kind of cooperation and contribution of the industry in this case. And last year, our countries joined collective attribution of number of APT attacks. So this collective attribution is also creating a kind of mechanisms both on national level and mechanisms of international cooperation, information sharing, something that might be very useful in the future also to discourage potential cyber aggressors. Raul.
Yes, I think that the attribution process is already working quite well, because we have seen several cases where countries have come together and done it already. And if I compare it with the system or the system that we didn't have like years ago, it reminds me the first big cyber attacks that were done against Estonia in 2007. We didn't have this attribution mechanisms in place, and somehow the like-minded countries were able to come together and solve the problem even then. And now we have implemented the official processes how to do that, not only looking at the technical details that we never gonna get enough, but also looking at the wider context. So I think it's, of course, we can improve the system, but in general terms, I think it's a great mechanism that is in place.
Thank you very much. Now I think we can afford some questions from the floor. I hope that we'll have some volunteers. Those issues that we discuss here, I think they are becoming more and more prominent even in the public domain. We witness growing interest from the side of think tank community, academia. There are many articles published in scientific journals, so there's already kind of substantive body of research dedicated to those issues. I see one hand raised over there, please.
Hi there, thank you very much for this discussion. My name is Ivan Belostenko. I'm an Israeli correspondent for Ichpot TV from Poland. My question is about, maybe I won't mention specific countries by name, but those countries that you referred to that have hostile policies and hostile intentions towards European countries. And we know that they're involved in multiple areas. It's not just fintech or a specific industry or sector. The attacks are coming across all sectors. What do you think, for example, in terms of Poland, what Poland should do when there's so many areas that these attacks are coming from? Everything from intellectual properties to central government, local government, the arts, the TV, technology, and everything. How should the Polish government respond to all these attacks? And in light of this conversation here, what should be the steps taken to get rid of these threats? Thank you.
Let me try to answer this question. We have many representatives of Polish government here during the day, but I think that one thing is to strengthen the resilience against cyber attacks, and this is a kind of long-term process that requires good institutional setup. In case of Poland, we last year implemented new legislation on national cybersecurity system that is on one hand implementing the EU NIS directive. On the other hand, it creates a kind of entire architecture of institutions dealing with cybersecurity and clear division of labor between them. On the other hand, apart from resilience, we also need some indigenous national capabilities to both detect and to react to malicious cyber activities. This is on the level of responsibility of state, national state, but there's also quite substantial international aspect here, and Poland as member of NATO, European Union, United Nations, OEC, we try to contribute to those efforts that are undertaken in the framework of those international structures. In case of European Union, for example, it was already mentioned, we are equipped with this cyber diplomacy toolbox. Within the framework of this toolbox, we recently also adopted specific dedicated cyber sanctions regime, and we hope, I mean, from the Polish perspective, we hope that we will be able to use it in order to deter, discourage future attacks, and we will adopt some lists of actors. And this is, as I said, a very intensive area of cooperation, international cooperation, both among members of different international institutions, but also among like-minded countries. We mentioned this statement issued in New York that was actually signed by almost 30 like-minded countries. All those efforts, I think they, in kind of combination, they should result in a kind of higher level of protection of security against malicious cyber attacks. And I think this is also our firm position that we are not afraid of attributing and naming actually malicious state actors. We see the value in doing this collectively. We joined those collective attributions that were conducted together with like-minded countries last year. And we would like also to see more advanced cooperation in this respect, both in case of European Union and in case of NATO. Let me also mention one particular aspect that is sometimes forgotten. Here in transatlantic area, we developed within Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe quite substantial set of confidence-building measures related to cyberspace, and we have a kind of unequal record of implementation of those CBMs, but they also provide a kind of tool to reduce unpredictability, to avoid escalation of cyber conflicts, and also increase the level of transparency in relations between state actors. So let's try to apply here a kind of comprehensive approach. Anybody else from the panel would like?
Just a short remark. I mean, resilience is one thing, but if it comes to taking countermeasures, then I think it's important that we ourselves look to it that our countermeasures stay within the framework of international law, so that we always keep the moral high ground, so to speak. And secondly, in Germany we have a discussion on possible hacking back. We in the foreign ministry and in general in the German government, we don't use this expression of hacking back. We think if there is a cyber attack, significant cyber attack, then it's first of all important to find a way to react by stopping the ongoing cyber attack or preventing the attacker from attacking again in the future. So reacting to a cyber attack technically is not only confined to a counter attack. It's on the contrary, stopping the attack is extremely important.
I just quickly
Liga,
wanted
please.
to also raise the point specifically looking at Poland, is that we had the pleasure last year at Cybersec to welcome several Polish companies to the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which I think was a significant step to have Polish industry involved in cybersecurity awareness as well. There are a number of civil society and industry groups that have also joined the Paris Call for Trust and Security in cyberspace from Poland, and also the Polish government has been very proactive in addressing election security measures and looking for resources to do that. So there are many other things that should be taken into consideration when addressing cybersecurity and disinformation and threats from state actors that go beyond just the things that can be done at the governmental level.
One thing that we have learned over the years is that it's very hard to deal with the cyber incident when it has already occurred. So it's much better to not to let the gin out of the bottle than put it back later. So that's why we have paid so much attention to how to prevent the cyber incidents from happening. That's why we have this digital ID, and that's why we also put so much emphasis to the 5G security at the moment, because it's better to implement and use the trusted technology and the trusted systems than to deal with all these issues later. So of course it doesn't answer the question what happens or what we should do if something happens, but I just would like to emphasize the prevention aspect of the cybersecurity.
More questions? Okay. On the left side, this microphone, please.
There are probably many questions, but we just can't see from here. You know.
Hello, it's Kevin Allison with Eurasia Group. I wanted to ask the panel, when it comes to deterring the actions of bad actors in cyberspace, how can you possibly approach the problem of measuring success of your efforts, first? And then second, especially with regard to the United States strategy of taking a more forward-leaning stance in cyberspace, how can you be sure that calibrating the U.S. reaction to malicious behavior is both strong enough to deter, but not so strong that it prompts a reaction that you might not like?
Robert, are you willing to answer?
No, that's a great question. Of course, yeah, I'm willing to answer. You know, I would first characterize the effort that we want to engage in as one that's beyond just the United States in creating a cyber deterrence initiative, a framework or a coalition of willing countries that will stand up and attribute, that is, respond to malicious state behavior and in some cases jointly impose consequences. If countries work together to impose consequences, whether those are diplomatic consequences in the form of PNGing intelligence agents or acting together to impose sanctions, that is in itself is going to be add legitimacy to the effort, but it's also going to be de-escalatory in the sense that a number of countries will do it together. The overall concern about you know, how we calibrate our response is one that we need to carefully weigh in every particular circumstance. I think that a key part of any endeavor like this is the messaging, the declarative messaging about why, well, in advance of any activity from a potential competitor or adversary, what kind of responses they can expect, and then being clear that the actions we're taking are transparent and they're done consistent with international law and the norms of responsible state behavior. So I think that if we're clear in our messaging and as we undertake these activities and we're thoughtful about how we do it, there shouldn't be any problem with moving out on consequences for malicious state activity.
Yes. No more questions?
Can I just have one short one? Just for
Yes.
then, since nobody's
Please go ahead.
It's a question about a company called Huawei. We haven't heard from the Polish government a clear statement, a clear declaration that Huawei is not going to be involved in the building of 5G network. How come we haven't heard a clear statement like that, that they're not going to be involved? And can you make a statement like that, that 5G in Poland is not going to be built by Huawei?
I'm afraid I'm not in position to make this kind of statement. We had earlier during the day a kind of special panel dedicated to 5G security, so with representatives of the Polish government, so I can refer you to this panel. Any other question? I have one question to the panelists, final probably. Next year, actually, in this venue, we are going to host next edition of the Internet Governance Forum. This year, Germany is the host nation. This is the process that is going on in the UN framework, but involves strong contribution of the civil society and non-governmental actors. What are the most pending issues right now on the agenda of internet governance that you can identify as topics for this meeting in Warsaw, probably as a kind of follow-up to the upcoming Berlin meeting? Rüdiger.
Yeah, thank you for this question. We are, of course, very proud that we can host the IGF meeting this year in Berlin in November. And of course, we will know only after the meeting what the things will be that should be discussed next year in Poland. I think it's here in Katowice. But two things come to mind. One is we have certainly find ways to make the IGF process more effective. And secondly, we have to increase or look to it that we keep the high level of inclusiveness of the IGF. And both issues, effectiveness and inclusiveness, are, I'd say, permanent challenges for the IGF process. And we think that we could start with supporting the findings and conclusions of the high-level panel on digital cooperation report that came out this summer, which contains some ideas on how to promote efficiency and inclusiveness of these multi-stakeholder processes, not just the IGF, but this is a start. I think the high-level panel report on digital cooperation, and we as Germany, we already committed ourselves to supporting the implementation of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
It's a great question. You're getting free advice, free planning right here. Committed to it, where people won't get back to you a few weeks later. They have to do it right now. I think it's also a tremendous question on the 50th anniversary of the internet. Data that the internet generates now is something that the people who helped generate the first internet connections had no idea would be available. And certainly as we move into 5G with the near ubiquitous connections of Internet of Things devices, and then the processing of that data, which is going to be done through machine learning and then artificial intelligence, we need to think very carefully about what that means for our society, the implications of that, and particularly the country where it was the birthplace of the Solidarity movement and the freedoms of millions of people being generated through throwing off authoritarian controls and models of governance. I think it's appropriate that at the next IGF you think about how we're ensuring that models of governance for the data of the future is empowering of people and not one that will be used as a tool of repression in the future. There's different models out there in the world. I'm not going to talk about the countries here, but we all know who they are. And I think that if the IGF can be a place where there's thought about the future of how we have our shared values related to privacy and individual liberties in infused into how we then govern the uses of data, I think that would be a very useful section. Of course, everything's bottom-up driven, and there'll be many other topics, but I think that would be a good one to consider.
Thank you. Liga, your thoughts about IGF?
I would myself like to see the previous question answered to some extent. There was a question from the audience, how do we measure success in this field? And I think we had one answer, but the rest of us are silent. I think that we should definitely focus in the next year to find where are the areas where we can measure success, how we can find the metrics necessary for success, and whether it's looking at the Paris call or the UN process or whatever comes out of these reports that are at a very global level, how can we take the small steps that measure the success to reach those norms?
Raul, final word.
Yeah, yes. I was thinking actually more broadly that what are going to be the most important topics that we will discuss about cybersecurity next year about the same time. And I think it's 5G, first of all, will not disappear. We will probably talk about that for many years. Because all these IoT things related to that, that's going to be a topic as well. And I think artificial intelligence, it seems to be that blockchain discussion has disappeared and now artificial intelligence has replaced that. So that's going to be probably a topic as well. Or actually people would like to know more about it. So that's for sure. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think we reached the time limit of our panel, so I would like to thank you for your remarks, your contribution, and I would like to thank our audience. I think it was a very good conclusion of this very intensive day.